So last week, we had some pretty intense stuff going on in our conversation and some new ways to think about how we read the Bible and the context of the Bible and where the Bible came from and all these big questions that are really challenging to wrestle with. So first of all, I want to let you know that this week is, I think, a little bit easier in terms of theological wrestling. But also I wanted to see if there are any questions or comments or concerns that, as you've been kind of pondering what we talked about last week or what we've been talking about in general. Anything anybody wants to say before we jump in today?
Well, just a comment. Are we going to get into the New Testament?
Eventually, yes. It's a long way away from us right now, it feels like. But hey, we're making progress. We spent
yes,
5 weeks on Genesis, and now we're all the way to Judges.
All this violence in the Old Testament here, yeah.
Oh, shoot, I forgot my Bible. Well, Katie, I texted you about my epiphany, I guess, about how God was keeping the Jews separate and wanted them to be recognizable as being separate and different. And it occurred to me that, that's what he said to the Christians. You're not of this world. You're not to be of this world, and you're to be separate. And so I got to thinking about then, so if we're being true to that, then people should recognize us by our words and actions as being Christian, as being one of God's people. And I don't know that we always act that way. I'm sure we don't always act that way. But it seems to me that what he's trying to do is make sure that people realize that being with him is not easy, but it's what has to happen to make other people come, I don't know. So the more violent things that happen to people would seem to me to turn people away. It's like, well, I don't want to be with those guys. They're all going to die. But anyway, I've thought about it a lot this week, and I've had some conversations with people that have been really troubling about who God is and what he does. And so I'm open for this week.
Karen, I just a thought, is it harder? Okay, considering we're maybe most of us, the older ones in the group, where we've grown, I don't know, maybe all of us are not having the same experience, but in my experience, I grew up in communities where there weren't any other people besides Christians. I mean, they come in a lot of flavors, but they're only Christians. And so I never thought about standing out because we were all kind of in the same realm, not acting the same, but kind of coming from the same place. It's almost like you've got to go to another country where there are different people to realize what it is to be, have an American attitude, be a Christian. I mean, all these things seem so different when you travel. But when you're here, it seems more normal unless you're really going out of your way to be extra Christian or something. I don't know. And it's harder here when you're in an homogenous group swimming in the water. I don't know.
So what you're describing, Pam, is called by scholars, it's called Christendom, the domination of Christianity over a particular culture, which has been the case for Europeans and European Americans for hundreds of years since the Middle Ages. And Christendom is dying. Christendom is already dead in Europe. Europe is very secular now, but Christendom is dying in America. I'll wait for her.
Why is that? Why is it?
because of that, because the difference between your religious faith and your national faith, your national identity, your identity as an American, these two things have been so smashed together that the feeling is that when we're criticizing something that the government is doing, we are criticizing our faith. And if we criticize something that someone is doing based on their faith, that we're criticizing our country. And that, as time goes on, becomes more and more challenging. And I'm actually pleased that Christendom is dying. In 1954 or even 1984, the pews were full and people felt like Christianity was successful because of that. But from my perspective, I would rather have 10 people who are there in the church and they're worshiping on Sunday and participating in what we're doing, who are there because of their faith in God and because they want to live into this call that God has called them to, rather than having 100 people, 90 of whom are there because if you don't see the butcher sitting in his pew on Sunday morning, then you're not going to buy from him, because part of being a part of society is being part of the church. I would rather church membership not be the same thing as being a Mason or being, part of the Moose's International or, whatever it is. I want Christianity to be something different. And so the social club aspect of Christianity is dying off. The expectation that you be in church on Sunday to be seen as a reputable member of your culture is dying off. And in terms of, the numbers, in terms of the power of Christianity, that's a bad thing. But I think in terms of the development of Christianity toward faithfulness in God and toward faithfulness in the call that God gives to us, it's actually a positive thing, because now people aren't forced, they're not required to come to fit in, because it's not part of fitting in, it's part of standing out. And I think that is, that brings us much closer to the realities of the early church as well. I don't think that we have ever had a time in the last almost 2,000 years when being a Christian looked as similar to the early church as now. So, maybe when we're finished with this series, we could go back and pick a book. First Peter is a really good one for this kind of conversation, thinking about, what does it look like to live as a person of God in the face of a culture that is hostile to what it is that you're trying to do.
That'd be good.
So we could work on that next if you're interested in that.
Okay.
Well, I don't know. In my studies, I found the biggest thing that really began to dilute the church was when Constantine made it a state church, and was no
Yep.
longer persecuted.
Yep.
I think that the church really flourishes in persecution, and that's being carried out today. The fastest growing churches in the world are number one in Iran and number two in Africa, of the fundamental Christian churches. And there it's because they're persecuted, and we don't have that here. And I think it's a very blasé situation that we've gotten into, and looked at really kind of a milk down version of salvation. And as I say, that's where I come from. And I agree with you. I would rather see, 10 in there rather than 100 seat fillers, as we always used to call them, that they would come in and sit in the seat. It happened in my younger days when the church directory also published the occupations and the businesses of the people in the church, based, meaning go. This is your butcher. You go to him, sort
Yep.
of thing. And
Yep.
that
Yep.
that I went through, and that we really disliked, that because you felt like a schmuck if you didn't if you didn't like that particular butcher and his
Yep.
food. You
Yep.
knew he
Yep.
was putting his thumb on there anyway. So, but anyway, but I agree with you. But I think that the church is growing, and I think it's a much more conservative church. I also think that we have hurt ourselves with our liberalistic approach to Christianity, that we have tried to combine government and Christianity and
Mm,
make them together. In other words, that we've liberalized everything, because the churches in Africa and Iran are basically very fundamentalist
well,
churches.
but the cultures in those places are also very fundamentalist. So again,
Yes,
it's
right.
the same
Yeah,
thing. It's
yeah,
it's
yeah,
imposing your politics on your religion.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so we could get into that, but let's
Yeah, let's go.
move into
I'm
this a
sorry,
little bit more.
but you asked for comments, so
Yes,
you got
I
my
did.
comment.
I did. All right, so let's hop in. I know I overheard Pam as I was coming in saying that she had to go early. So let's hop into this and get some
Okay, good.
conversations going before she has to go. So today we're going to talk about the book of Judges. Um, just reminding everyone that we've got this definition of violence that we're using, that violence is not necessarily about, injuring someone or doing some kind of harm to someone specifically, but it has more to do with the result of our attempts to step out of our place in God's good order, our attempts to undermine God's sovereignty, our attempts to take what does not belong to us in the way that God has ordained things to be. And then last week we talked a lot about the importance of context when we're reading these things. Who was this originally written for, and how does that information, how does that knowledge inform the way that we read and change the meaning of what it is that we're reading? And so that is once again going to be important for us as we look at Judges. So I don't think we have to harp too much on this stuff. If you want to, go back later and read over some of these things, you can. But the first place that I was going to take us today is Judges chapter 1, and just read the first couple of verses. But the purpose of that is to talk about the Canaanites, and we already kind of covered this last week and talked it over. So the Canaanites are talked about. The name Canaanites is repeated over and over and over, especially in this first chapter of Judges. And asking that question, who was this book written for, is really important, because as you read some of this stuff, it kind of becomes clear that the Canaanites are not a real people that are being described in a realistic kind of way. They talk about the Canaanites from a very exaggerated perspective. They talk about, for example, right there at the very beginning, in verse 7, 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off used to pick up scraps under my table, as I have done, so God has paid me back. I mean, this is exaggeration to the point of caricature, to the point of almost burlesque, the comedy of exaggeration and kind of potty humor and these kinds of things. And you see a lot of this in the book of Judges. So the Canaanites are not I think, to be seen as a people that God is opposing, that God sees as evil and therefore must be destroyed. The Canaanites are a symbol of what it is that needs to be rooted out in this religious reformation that we talked about last week, that King Josiah instituted. And if we read this from the perspective that it was written not as a historical record from the time that it happened, that the setting of the story is happening in, but it's a story about something that happened in the distant past that is helping the current people to understand the changes that are going on in their world, i.e., their way of life is being altered for the purpose of this new religious purity that they're being asked for, then I think it makes a lot more sense. There are no Canaanites at the time of King Josiah, and so the Canaanites are not a real people, to be, to that the stories are telling us how to interact with them or not. It's supposed to be symbolic. So this would be kind of like, today, and not as much, anymore, but maybe 30, 40 years ago, kids would play cowboys and Indians, and there are still Native American tribes around, don't get me wrong, but the way of life of an indigenous person is no longer the way that we would play cowboys and Indians in the past. But what that storyline did, what that play showed us, was that good is intended to prevail, and evil is eventually going to be destroyed. The problem comes because we still have indigenous peoples, and so we learn that they are the enemy, and they still exist. They don't exist in the same way that they do in that kind of play world, but they still are a people, and so the way that we treat them is affected by this. So if this, but if in 3 or 4 or 5 or 600 years there are no more Native Americans, they've all assimilated into the mainline culture, and people are still, children are still playing in this way, they are no longer, the people themselves. They are a symbol for a particular moral lesson that children are trying to learn. And so that's kind of what's going on here. That if the Canaanites don't exist, then they can be used as a symbol for the way that we're trying to teach our families, our people, to live their lives. So does that make sense to everyone? We kind of talked about this last week too.
Makes it much easier.
Okay. Yeah, so the Canaanites represent, the anti-God, the anti way of doing life in terms of, how God wants us to be. The Canaanites are always relying on their own power. They like to control others. They build their societies based on their own desires and not on God. And so they represent that impulse in us, and we are to fight against that. We are to attempt to work toward being the people that God calls us to be. So for today, because of the Judges is filled with a lot of exaggeration, a lot of overwrought description, a lot of just ridiculous, ridiculously high numbers of people show up to things, and ridiculous things happen, and so it's supposed to be read from a bit of a comedic standpoint, but it's not. It's not usually. Sometimes it is, but it's not usually ha ha funny. Usually it's kind of like a tragic comedy. It has elements of humor, of burlesque, of the ridiculous, but the message is attempting to say something that is poignant and important. I think in an attempt to kind of lighten the message a little bit, make it kind of a laugh, because if you don't laugh you will cry kind of perspective. So I want to start with kind of a weird story that people don't typically hear from the Bible, because it is one of these humorous but also a little bit scandalous stories, and it appears in Judges chapter 3. So we're going to start with verse 12, and I will read. There are a lot of crazy names in here, and the point here today is not for us to necessarily get down into the deep interpretation of individual words and things like that, but just to kind of get the sense of all of this. So starting with chapter 3, verse 12, we have the story of Ehud and King Eglon. Eglon is the king of the Moabites, and they are enemies of Israel. And so Ehud, it says in verse 15, is a Benjaminite. He is son of Gera the Benjaminite, a left-handed man. Now, from our perspective, this is just information. But to someone listening to this in context, the original context, this would have been a clue that this story is supposed to be funny, that this story is supposed to be a joke, actually, to a degree. Because Benjamin means son of the right hand.
The right hand, yes.
And so Ehud is a left-handed son of the right hand. So it's supposed to be a joke. So I'll kind of run us through this story really quick. Lots of potty humor in this one. So Ehud goes to see King Eglon, and I'm going to start with verse 16. Ehud made for himself a sword with 2 edges, a cubit in length, and he fastened it onto his right thigh under his clothes. So the way that things worked is almost everyone was right-handed. You take your right hand, and if you want to, if you want to be able to grab your sword or your knife really quickly, you would strap it to the inside of your left thigh. So you would have a little band around your thigh, and there would be a little holster, and you would keep your knife in there. So you could take your right hand and you could stick it in there under your robes really quickly and pull out your knife. But because Ehud is left-handed, he puts his knife on his right thigh. So he comes to Moab, or to Eglon in Moab, and it says, then he presented the tribute. He brought a tribute to King Eglon of Moab. Now Eglon was a very fat man. Again, we're getting into our joke here. When Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he sent the people who carried the tribute on their way. But he himself turned back at the sculptured stones near Gilgal and said, "I have a secret message for you, O king." So the king said, "Silence," and all his attendants went out from his presence. Ehud came to him while he was sitting alone in his cool roof chamber and said, "I have a message for you from God." So he rose from his seat. So at this point, we can assume that, as the people enter into the presence of the king, they are searched, just like they are today. But the way that you search someone is you kind of pat their robes around their left thigh to see if they have any weapons, because that's where you keep a weapon. But if you're left-handed, you put it on your right thigh. They didn't check. And so he still had his knife with him. And so when the king sent all of his attendants away so that he could have this secret conversation with Ehud, guess what? The left-handed guy still has his weapon. So Ehud reached with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and thrust it into Eglon's belly. The hilt also went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not draw the sword out of his belly, and the dirt came out. That is a euphemism for some very stinky things that happen when someone's dead. And Ehud went out into the vestibule and closed the doors of the roof chamber on him and locked them. After he had gone, the servants came. When they saw that the doors of the roof chamber were locked, they thought he must be relieving himself in the cool chamber. So they waited until they were embarrassed. So Eglon is dead. He's got this sword in his fat belly, and the fat closed over the blade because he's so fat. And he involuntarily relieves himself all over himself because he's dying and dead. And his servants are smelling this terrible stench and thinking that he's in there, taking care of business. So they waited until they were embarrassed. When he still did not open the doors of the roof chamber, they took the key and opened them. There was their lord lying dead on the floor. Ehud escaped while they delayed and passed beyond the sculptured stones and escaped to Sarah. So this is supposed to be, this is supposed to be a joke. This is supposed to be a funny story expressing unexpected situations with, and some of the same stuff we still joke about today: fat people and people who behave differently getting the upper hand, that kind of thing. And when we read the Bible, and especially when we read Judges from this very serious, this is the Holy Scripture, it must be taken very seriously. When we read this from that perspective, we miss the point completely. It just goes straight over our heads. When we read with a little bit of tongue-in-cheek, when we read with a little bit of humor, when we kind of put on our "I'm a little kid again" hats and laugh about the fact that this guy's so fat that he gets a knife stuck in him and it's stuck in there so hard that he can't get it out because he's so fat, and there's poop jokes and all kinds of stuff like that is going on here that we miss when we read too seriously. And so there's comedy in this, not the kind of comedy that I'm super into, but still an attempt to be comedic. I see some little smiles coming from people as I'm explaining this. But this is kind of the easier side of things. As we get into some of the other exaggerations, we'll see that the comedy points toward some very tragic realities. So any comments about any of that?
Did anyone else have a mental picture of what was going on? I think that's we all have, but as little kids we let it come out, but as a laugh. But as an adult, oh, I don't dare do
Right.
anything like that. Yeah.
Right. But you're supposed to laugh.
You're supposed to laugh. Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, we are trained as we get older not to laugh at these things. Yes. So we have this, element of comedy here. But like I said, there's also tragedy within the comedy. So I picked out several stories for us to take a look at, and one of these stories is pretty much the opposite of this one. It is really hard to read. It's really hard to hear. It involves rape. It involves gory murder. But I think it's important to take a look at, if everybody is okay with that. And this appears in Judges chapter 19. This is the story, the whole chapter is the story of the Levite and his concubine, is typically how it's referred to. And I don't have time for us today to read the whole thing. I encourage you to go back and look at the whole thing if you have time later, because it really is a story about the Levite and the violence that he does to himself, to his neighbors, and to God, because of his attempts to undermine God's authority, to do things on his own power, to have things go his way, and be very selfish and not live the way that God wants him to live. But I want to start with verse 16 in this story, and we're going to go through verse 30 at the end of the chapter. So 16 to 30. If one of you would like to read, you can. Otherwise, I will read it. And like I said, this is a pretty tough story to get through.
I can read part of it for you.
Okay.
Okay. Let's see. Judges, what we got here? 1916.
Yes.
That evening, an old man from the hill country of Ephraim, who was living in Gebeth, the men of the place were Benjamites, came in from his work in the fields. When he looked and saw a traveler in the city square, the old man asked, "Where are you going? Where do you come from?" He answered, "We are on our way from Bethlehem to Judea, to a remote area in the hill country of Ephraim, where I live. I have been to Bethlehem in Judah, and now I'm going to the house of the Lord. No one has taken me into his house. We have both straw and fodder for our donkeys, and bread and wine for ourselves, your servants, your maidservant, and the young man with us. We don't need anything. You are welcome at my house," the old man said. "Let me supply whatever you need. Only don't spend the night in the square." So he took him into his house and fed his donkeys after they had washed their feet. They had something to eat and drink. While they were enjoying themselves, some of the wicked men of the city surrounded the house, pounding on the door. They shouted to the old man who owned the house, "Bring out the man who came to your house so that we can have sex with him." The owner of the house went outside and said to them, "No, my friends, don't be so vile. Since this man is my guest, don't do this disgraceful thing. Look, here is my virgin daughter and his concubine. I will bring him out to you. I will bring them out to you now, and you can use them and do to them whatever you wish. But to this man, don't do such a disgraceful thing." But the men would not listen to him. So the man took his concubine and sent her outside to them, and they raped her and abused her throughout the night. And at dawn, they let her go. At daybreak, the woman went back to the house where her master was staying, fell down to the door, at the door, and lay there until daylight. Now, I'll let you take it from there, Katie.
Okay. In the morning, her master got up, opened the doors of the house, and he went out to go on his way. There was his concubine laying at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. "Get up," he said to her, "we are going." But there was no answer. Then he put her on the donkey, and the man set out for his home. When he had entered his house, he took a knife, and grasping his concubine, he cut her into 12 pieces, limb by limb, and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. Then he commanded the men whom he sent, saying, "Thus you shall say to all the Israelites, has such a thing ever happened since the day that the Israelites came up from the land of Egypt until this day? Consider it, take counsel, and speak out."
Okay, I'm missing the point.
Okay. So on the face of it, this story, at least the part that I have presented to you today, there's more to the story. And like I said, I encourage you to read the whole thing. But what I've presented to you today is a story about a man and his concubine. A concubine is kind of a second wife. Often a concubine comes from purchasing a female into slavery to work for you, and then you decide that you want to do more with her than just have her work for you, and so you take her as your concubine. And so she's there to serve her master, but she is also there to have sex with him. And at the beginning of the story, we learn that he perhaps has been abusing her, and so she runs away and goes back to her home in Bethlehem. And so he goes after her and spends some time with her father, and then he says, "It's time for us to go home." But it's a bad time of day to leave for that kind of a lengthy trip. And so the father says, "Oh, no, please stay. I want you to stay until tomorrow. It's not safe for you to travel." But the man says, "No, I want to go now." So they leave at a bad time, and they're traveling through, and they get to Gibeah, which is, in theory, part of Israel. It should be a safe place to be. He finds this man to take him in, and they go into his house. And then you'll see some things that are pretty familiar. The man comes into they come into the man's house, and they're in the house enjoying themselves. And the men of the city, a perverse lot, surrounded the house and started pounding on the door. They said to the old man, the master of the house, "Bring out the man who came into your house so that we may have intercourse with him." And the master of the house, went out to them and said, "No, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. This man is my guest. Do not do this vile thing." And then he offers his virgin daughter and his concubine. This is the exact same thing that we saw in Genesis when the people of Sodom, who are supposed to be, representatives of evil and anti-God, come and surround the house and try to get the messengers that come and visit Lot and stay with Lot. And Lot says, "Oh, here, you can have my daughters, and that'll
Yeah.
get rid of your
Okay,
lust."
good.
Well, in that story, the daughters don't go out. The daughters stay safely inside, even though they're offered, because the men, the men don't want the girls. They want to violate this hospitality law. But in this case, the man, the traveler, takes his concubine and puts her out to them. And the description of what happens to her is just horrendous. And I think we learn to kind of gloss over a lot of this stuff. But when we read this from a true perspective of like Ben said, just thinking about this in our minds and creating a picture, this woman was abused to such a degree that in the morning she was lying on the ground with her hands on the threshold. She was desperately trying to get back in the door. This is how abusive this was. And he says to her, "Get up, we are going." But there was no answer. And so the story doesn't tell us why there's no answer. Is she already dead? Or was she abused to such a degree that she's just in shock? She's terrified and traumatized by this experience that she's had. But he doesn't care. He picks her up, throws her on the donkey, and goes home. And when he gets home, he takes a knife and cuts her into pieces and sends her out to the different tribes. And then it gets even more confusing, because in most English translations, there is this last line is, I guess, supposed to be the moral of the story. "Thus shall you say to all the Israelites, has such a thing ever happened since the day that the Israelites came up from the land of Egypt until this day? Consider it, take counsel, and speak out." So this is the way that this is translated, the way that this the quotation marks are added and the punctuation is added to this. The message that we're supposed to get from this is the man, the Levite, who put his concubine out to these guys and then took her home, and she was so destroyed or dead that he decided that he was going to cut her up and send her out. He's trying to send a message to Israel that you are bad. But there are other versions of this story that appear in different manuscripts of the Bible that indicate a different punctuation, which is the man sends the body parts out to the 12 tribes, and when the Israelites see it, when they see these body parts, they say, "Has such a thing ever happened? Consider it, take counsel, and speak out." And so in that case, the condemnation is not from the man to Israel, but is from Israel to the man. And so it completely changes the meaning of the story depending on which translation, which perspective you take on it. But the bigger point that I wanted to make with bringing this story to your attention is, again, we have this exaggeration. We have the conversation between the two people about whether or not he's going to take the man in is exaggerated. "Look, I have everything I could possibly need. I have food for myself and my donkeys. I have everything I need. We don't need anything from you except the shelter. Please give us the shelter." And then the man says, "Oh, no. You need to come in. We're going to wash your feet. We're going to eat together. We're going to drink together. We're going to enjoy ourselves together, because hospitality is so important." And then the men of the city, all of these people, everyone comes around and they demand this thing, and it's very much like the Lot story. And then, the abuse of the woman all night long. They let her go, and then, she's either already dead or she's so traumatized that she can't even speak. It's just completely overwrought. The purpose of the story is to be this exaggeration, this intense level of exaggeration. And again, the point of the exaggeration is so that you read through the basics, through the literal interpretation, and try to understand what this is trying to say to us. And Judges has a lot of violence, especially against women. And I think the reason for that is because, again, we've got symbols going on here. this concubine, there are other stories like Jephthah's daughter, are the women are symbols of Israel's brokenness, because as we all know, as a society declines, as a society becomes more turned inward on itself, and the leadership becomes more selfish and isn't following God's ways of leading and doing things, the first groups to suffer are the more vulnerable groups, the poor, the ill, the outcasts, those, you know, those who don't have family, and women, because women are understood not to, you know, at this time, not to have the same position in society as men. And so in these stories, the point is not, well, this is, you know, well, it's in the Bible, so it must be okay to treat women this way. The point is that if the women are suffering, that means that we're going in the wrong direction. If the poor are suffering, that means that we're going in the wrong direction. If the widows are suffering, it's because we're going in the wrong direction. If the children are suffering, it's because we're going in the wrong direction. And so I think, you know, as we look at these examples of violence in the book of Judges, again, it's not an attempt to, you know, it's not an attempt to suggest that this is how we ought to be behaving as the people of God, but it's trying to send us a message about who we are and what happens and how we can guard against that. And so the Canaanites are the symbol of what we should not be doing. We should not be relying on ourselves. And that the women are a symbol of the brokenness within us, that as Israel, through these stories, cycles through this process of falling away from God and worshiping foreign gods and getting involved in things that God doesn't want them to get involved with, and then things start to go wrong, and then they cry out and say, oh, God, deliver us, and God sends a judge to save them. And then they're so grateful, and they promise to reestablish right relationship with God and each other and their creation, and then, you know, everything's okay for a couple minutes until once again they start turning away. And so it becomes this endless cycle with the Israelites that, you know, we from here, of course, we don't do that. We learn from our mistakes and change, and you know, we are faithful to God. We're just the same. It's been like that, you know, since time immemorial. But the purpose of these stories is not to tell us, you know, what the people were doing at this time to bring about that change. The purpose of these stories is to tell us about who we are in relationship to God. And so the way that women are treated in this book, like in this story and like in several other stories, is a message. It's not, this is how women should be treated. It's when women start getting treated this way, we know that something is wrong, and we need to right it before it gets so bad that we can't go back. And unfortunately, we often don't heed that message either. So questions, comments about that?
Really?
Well, you know, I think always about Jesus in the way that he treated women. And, you know, I've always been so impressed by that, because in that day and time, women were not treated well, as we're reading about. And yet Jesus went out of his way to be kind to women. Is that because of this history that he was sent to change that dynamic, or I appreciate what you're saying about when women are treated so badly, it means there's something wrong with the society, because I absolutely believe that. And I believe that's what we've been living through for the last, I don't know how many years. I mean, women are still treated badly, you know. And so, but I've always appreciated that about Jesus, that he paid special attention to women. So was that God's way of telling people that women were to be cherished? And then how do some people take that and make it so that women have to be subjected? And how do they twist that around so that women are not equal to men? I mean, poor Ben. You don't know what it feels like to be part of a minority group, but the rest of us do. The other three of us do.
So I think it's important in the Gospels that it's always the women who find out about the resurrection first. The first evangelists are always women in all four Gospels. And I think that there are two reasons for that. The first one being a theological reason that yes, Jesus came to, not to change things, because this, coming from the time of Josiah, is still acknowledging the problem. They're acknowledging, if we read this properly and don't read this as, a guidebook for how we should be treating women, but as the condemnation of the treatment that these women receive, that it is. If we read it that way, then the understanding that the way that we treat women, the way that we treat children, the way that we treat orphans and widows and other vulnerable people in our culture, that says everything that you need to know about who we are and where we are in terms of the success or failure of our culture, our society as a whole. That's always been true. And they have known that. But Jesus came to remind us that God is to be found not with the powerful, but with those who have no power. Not with the ones who have everything, but with the hopeless, those who have nothing. And so, you notice that most of the people who get it right in the Gospels in terms of, figuring out who Jesus is really and understanding what's going on here and how they should respond, they are typically people who are in those vulnerable populations, in those minority populations. They're women, they're young people, they're people who have social outcast diseases like leprosy and things like that. They're the poor. They're the ones who are sitting at the city gate begging because they're blind or lame or what have you. Jesus specifically went to those people to reach out to them, to show us that is where God is. That is who God, if God is going to choose sides in a situation, God is going to be on the side of those who do not have, because violence is taking from those people what it is that they rightfully deserve. And so God is trying to right that violence by being with them, by bringing them new resources and new hope so that they can get what it is that they need and get what it is that they deserve within God's good order. So I think that's one reason. But the second reason is a practical reason. If you are somebody with power, if you are happy with the way things are, you hated Jesus because he was there to tell you that the way that you were doing things is wrong, that the way that the society was organized, you thought that was God's plan. You thought that was how God wanted it to be because you were reading that law and you were reading it from a very literal perspective. But God does not care about your festivals. God doesn't care if your hair on your temples is the right length. God cares about the way that you're treating each other. God cares about the way that you organize your society in a violent way or God's way. Those are the two options. And every single time we choose violence because we are a people of violence. We are violent from our youth, it said in the Noah story. And that's always been true. And so those people don't like Jesus. They don't want to be involved with Jesus. But the people who are looking for something else, the people who are failing within this system, are the ones who are attracted to Jesus because he has a different way. He has a different understanding. He is offering something that the society cannot offer to those people who are struggling and failing. So if Jesus were here today, I know that I wouldn't be following him because I'm certainly not completely content with everything that's going on in the world, but the reason I'm not content is because I try to be like Jesus. I try to reach out into the world and understand things from other people's perspectives. Jesus would be, on the corner of Cypress and Hilltop with the homeless people who are begging. Jesus would be at One Safe Place with the battered women and their families. That's where Jesus is to be found. And I think that's the message with the women in the New Testament, from my perspective.
Well, I would concur with you very, very much, Katie, but I have conundrums also on this. One of the first people that Jesus called, of course, was Mary Magdalene. And she traveled with him all along. But yet when the apostles decided to replace Judas so that they would 12, they chose a man by lot. And why would God not make that Lot a woman? That's kind of a conundrum. I don't know. I don't think there is an answer. I'm not looking for an answer. It's just fascinating to me that even the apostles in those times were not equating women with what men could do. And that's one of the questions I have on my list to ask God when I see him.
Well, I would say, again, we have to think about the context in which that story was written down, because, scholars read the New Testament and they say that the earliest writings that we have from the New Testament are Paul's letters. There are certain letters that are authentically from this man named Paul, who traveled around spreading this message about Jesus, to the Greeks. And so those are the earliest things that we have. The Gospels, even though chronologically, in terms of the story that they contain, they come before Paul, they were actually not written down until several decades after Paul. And by that point, this movement of Jesus, this attempt to, change the way things were, is now starting to form into an institution. And it hasn't yet reached the point of Constantine. That doesn't come until the 300s. But they are trying to become mainstream. They are trying to fit in. They're trying to show the Romans and the Jews that they are not to be feared, that they fit in okay. And so the way that things are presented has a lot to do with the political pressures around the writer. For example, the Gospel of John is incredibly anti-Semitic because John is writing in a place where we don't want to be associated with the Jews, because the Jews are being persecuted at this time. They're being burned at the stake in Rome. They're being blamed for the fire that happened, with with Nero, and the story that is told about how, Nero fiddled while Rome burned. The Jews were blamed for that fire. And so the writer of the Gospel of John is attempting to make a very strong statement that we are Christians, we are not Jews, we are not the same as these people that you hate, that you are trying to persecute. Please don't persecute us, we're different. Whereas there are other places in different Gospels where there are attempts to make sure that we maintain that equation with Jews, because Jews were given religious autonomy and were allowed to practice the way that they wanted to practice, and were considered a legitimate religion of the Roman Empire. And so, yes, of course, we're still Jews. We do things a little bit differently, but no, we're not practicing an illegal religion that you need to squash. Everything's fine. We're nothing to see here. Everything, we're okay. And so there's a lot of that, kind of interpretive attempts within the original context of the writing that we have to read through and understand, so that we can get to the heart of the matter and not get distracted by those kinds of things. So that's what I would say. What else?
Wow.
I've got several more stories that we could look at, if you'd like. They're kind of the same deal. You're probably mostly familiar with the story of Gideon. Gideon is a very young man. He's called by God to be a judge and rescue the people. he collects this huge army, tens of thousands of soldiers, and that's crazy. There weren't that many people around, let alone men at this time that you could pull together. And then that's too many. God says, "Oh, I don't want all these people. Do all these little experiments to see how we can dwindle this down. Have them drink out of the river, and the ones who drink with their hands and bring the water up with their hands like a cup, send them home. The ones who drink like dogs and lap it up with their tongues, just keep them." And so he dwindles it down to only 300. Yeah, see, this is funny. This is supposed to be a joke. It's supposed to be funny. And so then he's only got 300 people, and they go up into the hills around the encampment of the enemy. Why you would encamp in a valley so that the enemy could have the advantage at the top of the mountain. Another joke. That would never happen. But Gideon is able to get that victory, not because of what they do, but because of what God does. And it's intentional. It's supposed to be ridiculous. 300 people making noise can't possibly beat this huge army that's going to attack you unless God gets involved. And so again, it's the tragic comedy. It's the the point that no leader can lead properly but God. There are several places in the book of Judges where it says, in those days Israel had no king, and was misguided and blah 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 blah. There are 4 different places where it mentions that Israel had no king. And I think the purpose there is not to say, well, it's not their fault that they are behaving so poorly. If they had a king, they would be led properly, and they would be doing what God wanted them to do. I think the point there is Israel had no king. Of course Israel had a king. Israel had God, but they were ignoring God. They were leaving God behind. They were doing their own thing. They were making themselves king of their lives rather than making God king of their lives. Yeah. And that is why all these terrible things are happening to them.
Thank you, guys. I'll see you next week.
Yep.
This
Thanks,
is a good
Pam.
breaking point. Okay, I'll sing. This is a lot to think about.
Again, I tried so hard.
Yeah.
It's fun.
Survival.
Take care, Pam. See ya.
Bye.
Maybe we ought to change the name to Humor in the Bible.
So I think we're kind of still in the same realm that we have been.
Yeah.
But we want to we want to be reading from the right context. If we want to get out of this what it's supposed to be saying to us, then we have to understand who it was written for, and we have to read it that way. It's hard. This is a good story. So when I was in seminary, when you take these ancient language classes, it's really difficult. They're completely different, especially the Hebrew is so hard. It's so different from English grammar and everything. And they get you to a point where you're no longer translating. You're kind of beyond translating just sentences that the grammar book makes up for you. Finally, it's time for you to start translating the Bible. And so they give you your first Hebrew passage from the Bible that you have to translate. And usually you do it with a group so that you're not doing this by yourself for the first time. And I remember when my group finished translating our little passage, we had someone in the group read it out loud. And we were so excited because we said, that sounds like the Bible. And I'm not sure exactly what we meant by that, but the way that we read the Bible, the way that we're trained to hear the Bible is different than the way that we're trained to hear and read everything else. And I'm not entirely sure why that's the case. Other than, that we elevate the Bible above everything else, and we're trained that we're supposed to take it so seriously, and that it's the Word of God, and we have to read it with great care, and we have to pick apart every word to understand it. But sometimes that's not how you're supposed to read it. Sometimes a funny story is a funny story. Sometimes a funny story has a poignant moral to it, but it's still a funny story, and it's okay to laugh. We're supposed to get humor and entertainment out of some of this stuff. But then we're also supposed to heed the message. And the message isn't, well, this is a guidebook for how we are to treat women, or this is a guidebook for how we are to treat foreigners. It has something different to say to us. And when we read it when we stop taking ourselves so seriously, I guess is what I'm trying to say here, we can get to the heart of the matter a little bit more easily.
But I think even in the humor of it, in the stories, it's like, to me, it's like Christ's parables. There's always a central theme in there. As long as you don't take it and beat it to death, that you can pull from the stories, be they humorous or actual, really. And that's, as I say, that's the way I read the Bible, as it all leads up to Christ, and that's what it's leading to.
Yeah, the parables are like that too, that if you're supposed to read them, there's supposed to be humor, there's supposed to be the ridiculous in there, people doing things that are completely anti-logical,
Yes.
unexpected situations. And Jesus just tells them, like, well, of course this is what's expected. And so we don't understand that what he's saying is completely crazy, and that everyone would be laughing hysterically at this person making these stupid choices. Why would they do this?
Why would they do that? Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So anything else for today? I think we've, I don't want to, beat a dead horse here, but I think we're getting
I
to the
agree
end.
with Pam. We have a lot to think about.
Well, I tried to make it a little lighter this week.
Yes,
We had
appreciate that.
We had the challenging passage there, but
Yeah.
a little bit of humor, a little bit of making sure that we're not taking ourselves and this whole process too seriously.
Yeah.
I think God's got a sense of humor.
Oh, yes, yes. And Jesus had a beautiful sense of humor.
Otherwise, why are there giraffes?
Why are there giraffes?
platypuses?
Oh, that's a good one. I like that one.
All right. Well, thank you both so much, and Pam too, even though she's already gone. It's been another good conversation, and I will see you all next week again. Have a great week. Well, not you, Ben.
Okay.
Drive
Bye-bye.
carefully. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
I will. Bye.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.